On July 1st, 1936, the hull for a massive German warship was laid down in Hamburg in secret. By February of 1939, the hull was complete and she was launched with Hitler and many other Nazi officials in attendance. At the event, the Führer reported that the ship would be named Bismarck, after the famed Otto von Bismarck. The ship was said to be 35,000 tons, the max weight limit for capital ships as stated by the World War I treaty. In reality, the ship was well over 50,000 tons. It would be another 18 months before the ship was ready for combat, as all of the armament and superstructure still needed to be fitted. The ship would also need sea trials before she could be ready. After her sea trials were complete, she was ready to fight. At this time, the German Kriegsmarine only had one battleship, although Bismarck's sister ship Tirpitz was under construction. They had 2 battle cruisers and 3 pocket battleships and no aircraft carriers. The commander of the German Navy, Admiral Erich Raeder, knew that this was a huge problem, and he had hoped that Germany would not go to war with Great Britain for at least a few more years to give the Kriegsmarine time to build more capital ships. Raeder was quoted to have said that if any of the Führer's new ships were intercepted by British heavy units, they would merely be able to die with dignity. Even with the lack of numbers of large German capital ships, Bismarck was the most powerful warship afloat at the time of her first mission. She was well over 50,000 tons and was equipped with 8 15-inch guns that could fire a shell nearly 2 tons over 20 miles. She was also more modern than most of her British counterparts like HMS Hood, the pride of the British Royal Navy. Hood had the same number and caliber of guns to Bismarck and was actually a little longer, but her rangefinders were very antiquated compared to Bismarck. She also had much thinner deck armor than Bismarck and was actually classified as a battle cruiser. The German Kriegsmarine decided that a direct conflict with British capital ships was far too risky, so the ship would be sent to commerce raid in the Allied shipping lanes. This was Great Britain's greatest fear. They knew that if Bismarck could sneak into the Atlantic Ocean and attack British convoys, that it could spell disaster for them. German U-boats and surface raiders were already causing huge problems for the British and had already sunk over 600,000 tons of shipping in the previous month alone. With Bismarck's massive artillery, she would be able to stand off and sink every ship in a convoy and never be brought under British fire. Winston Churchill once said that the only thing that truly frightened me in the war was the U-boat peril, and he was nearly as worried about Bismarck and German capital ships as he was about the U-boat peril.
Torpedotreffer! Torpedotreffer!
Admiral Gunter Lütjens was named the fleet commander for the operation, and Ernst Lindemann was named captain. Originally, Bismarck would rendezvous with the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and possibly Tirpitz if she was completed in time. However, Tirpitz was not yet ready. Scharnhorst was receiving work on her boilers, and Gneisenau had been damaged by British torpedoes. So on May 19, 1941, Bismarck departed Guntenhaven with the German heavy cruiser Prince Eugen and made for the Danish Straits. The idea was to break into the Atlantic completely unnoticed. However, the Germans were completely unaware that code breakers at Bletchley Park had broken enough German Enigma code to know that a breakout into the Atlantic was not far off, although they were still unaware when this would happen, and German intelligence had shown that the bulk of the British home fleet was still anchored at Scapa Flow. The two ships arrived at the Norwegian coast on the evening of May 20th, where a British Spitfire managed to get close enough to snap a photo of the ships. The Spitfire had to make a quick exit because of German Luftwaffe air cover. The Germans were unaware that the British were now fairly certain that the Bismarck was going to try and break out into the Atlantic. With this photo, Admiral John Tovey ordered the British battlecruiser HMS Hood and the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales to put to sea and patrol the Denmark Strait, one of several possible breakout locations for the German ships. On the 22nd of May, the two German ships made for the Denmark Straits to break out into the Atlantic. Not long after, Admiral Tovey had dispatched the home fleet headed for the Norwegian coast at top speed to attempt to intercept the two German ships. By this time, the two German ships were being shadowed by the British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk. The Prince Eugen nearly opened fire on Suffolk at one point. The German ships tried to lose them with maneuvers, but were unable to do so because of radar. Eventually, two unknown warships were detected heading towards the German ships. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was about to begin. At 5:45 a.m. on May 24, 1941, the British warships under command of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland raced in to engage the German ships. Holland knew that his ship was vulnerable to plunging fire at long range and hoped to close the range to where any hits would impact the ship's side belt armor. He was very confident. He knew that his guns matched the caliber of Bismarck's, and that HMS Prince of Wales was a brand new battleship that had 10 14-inch guns. At around 14 miles, the Hood opened fire on Prince Eugen, mistaking the ship for the Bismarck. Because Hood was trying to close the distance, she could not bring her forward guns to bear. Her aft guns would have to wait for the ship to make its turn. Shortly after, Prince of Wales opened fire, but on Bismarck and not Prince Eugen. The gunnery officer on Bismarck asked twice for permission to return fire on the British battleships, but Admiral Lütjens would not return fire. He was under strict orders to not engage British capital ships under any circumstances. Eventually, Captain Lindemann, who was tired of Lütjens' inability to give the order to fire, said, "I will not have my ship shot out from under my ass," and then he gave the order to open fire. Unlike the British ships that were trying to close the distance and a head-on charge, the German ships could bring their full broadsides to bear. Bismarck also had faster reload times over the Hood, since she was a much newer ship. At around 8 miles, Admiral Holland ordered a 20-degree turn to port. This would allow Hood to open fire with all her guns. Both Bismarck and Prince Eugen concentrated all their fire on Hood, and in a very short order, Prince Eugen had hit Hood somewhere behind her main mast, starting a fire. After this hit, Bismarck had found her range to the Hood and fired a full salvo, and fired her 6-inch secondary guns at Prince of Wales. Holland then ordered a second 20-degree turn to port to bring Hood and Prince of Wales into a full parallel course with Bismarck and Prince Eugen. This would bring Hood's full side belt armor in line with Bismarck's salvos, greatly reducing the risk of deck armor penetration. Prince Eugen was then ordered to concentrate all her fire on Prince of Wales and scored 2 hits and started a fire. At around 7 minutes into the battle, Bismarck hit the Hood with a salvo. It is not confirmed if Hood was finished with her turn to port or not. The results were the same. 2 shells missed the ship, but 2 hit home, somewhere in the thinner stern deck armor behind her rear funnel. The shells detonated in Hood's aft projectile cordite storage magazine. Most battleships have their shells on top of the cordite magazine. Cordite is far more volatile and more likely to go off when hit. Hood's, however, was backwards, making her much more vulnerable. Once the cordite began to burn, it burned out of control and breached the ammunition magazines underneath. An enormous explosion was followed in the stern half of the ship that tore the ship in two. At first it seemed that the Hood was all right, as her bow continued to move forward out of the explosion for a short period. However, water was quickly rushing into the two halves, and very quickly Hood's bow began to raise into the air, followed shortly after by her stern section. In just 8 short minutes of battle, Hood had foundered beneath the waves, to the cheers of Bismarck's crew, who realized the weight of their victory. They had just sunk the pride of the Royal Navy and the most powerful warship in the British Navy. Hood disappeared beneath the waves and took 1,418 officers and men with her. Only 3 men survived the horrific explosion. However, Bismarck could not celebrate for long, as HMS Prince of Wales, now maneuvering to avoid Hood's wreckage, was still firing. Prince of Wales hit Bismarck with her first salvo after Hood's loss, but Bismarck also landed a hit on her with her first salvo at Prince of Wales. The shell hit Prince of Wales' bridge, killing nearly everyone with the exception of her captain, John Leach, and a couple of others. Now, both German ships concentrated fire on the Prince of Wales, and things continued to deteriorate for the British ship. Since Prince of Wales was so new, her 2 quad-barrel turrets were malfunctioning, only allowing the ship to fire her single twin-barrel turret. Even with the main battery issues, Prince of Wales still managed to score 3 hits on Bismarck. 2 of the 3 shells hit below the waterline and caused flooding for Bismarck. At 6:13, Leach gave the order to retreat. With the ship being damaged and so many of the main guns not operational, he could not risk losing his ship. Prince of Wales covered her escape with a smoke screen, and Bismarck and Prince Eugen continued to fire until she was out of effective range. Captain Lindemann recommended that they pursue the fleeing British ship and finish her off, but Lütjens knew his orders not to engage the Royal Navy and overruled him. The ship was to make for the North Atlantic. The 3 hits on Bismarck had caused a decent list to port and a loss of fuel oil. Other than that, the ship was undamaged. In the end, it was a resounding victory for the Germans, but Lütjens was worried that the loss of Hood would bring vengeance from the Royal Navy down on them. Just after sinking the Hood, Lutjens reported that Bismarck had sank a British battle cruiser, most likely HMS Hood, and that they had heavily damaged a battleship, that being King George V or Renown. He also reported 2 cruisers that were shadowing them. He then sent his next moves to the High Command, which were to detach Prince Eugen from the formation, to commence her own commerce raiding, and then the Bismarck would head straight for Saint-Nazaire in France for repairs to damage that had been suffered. After this, Prince of Wales regrouped with the British cruisers and got behind them to help in shadowing the Bismarck. German Admiral Karl Dönitz offered to send all available U-boats to aid Bismarck and sink any British ships that they could. Lutjens gladly agreed, and several U-boats were sent to meet the Bismarck and 2 locations for protection purposes. The British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, ordered that all available ships in the area join the Bismarck hunt. The home fleet was steaming at full speed to attempt to intercept Bismarck. However, they were still 350 nautical miles away on May 24, 1941. 3 cruisers were ordered to patrol the Denmark Strait in case Bismarck tried to turn and make a run back home. The battleship Rodney was ordered to join the home fleet and aid in the pursuit. And older pre-World War I battleships Revenge and Ramillies were ordered to join in the chase as well. In total, 6 battleships and battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers were sent to hunt down the Bismarck. This was a huge issue for the British, as it took so many ships away from convoy escort and other duties that were needed for the war effort. This was how important it was to sink the Bismarck. Also, 9 out of 10 of Prince of Wales' main guns were repaired, and she was then sent in front of the 2 cruisers to attack Bismarck again if there was an opportunity. Then, when it became time to detach Prince Eugen, Bismarck turned to face Prince of Wales and the 2 cruisers to create a distraction. Prince of Wales opened fire and ended up firing 12 salvos in total. Bismarck fired 9 back, but neither side scored any hits. But with this distraction, Prince Eugen was successfully able to escape. Bismarck's speed was reduced due to damage from Prince of Wales, but she could still make 27 knots, the top speed of the ships in the home fleet. The only way they would be able to get there before Bismarck reached friendly waters would be to slow the ship down. This was attempted by the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious that had been detached from the home fleet and launched an airstrike with its Swordfish torpedo bombers. The airmen were very green and nearly attacked HMS Norfolk. When they did finally attack Bismarck, she was ready for them. Bismarck fired her main battery and secondary battery in front of the planes to try to distract them. Out of the 9 planes, none were shot down, but only 1 torpedo struck the battleship amidships on the armor belt. The damage was minor, but in the maneuvering, the flooding from previous damage had worsened, and a boiler was lost, slowing her down to 16 knots. The speed was shortly increased to 20 knots after work was completed, and then a max of 28 knots later on. The pursuing warships were forced to zigzag to avoid any U-boats that may be in the area, allowing Bismarck to increase the distance between them. As the ships were in a zigzag turn, Lutjens decided to make a large turn in the opposite direction and increase Bismarck's speed to 28 knots. With this unexpected maneuver, Bismarck steamed out of the range of radar and disappeared, heading directly for France. Admiral Tovey on King George V incorrectly decoded a message that Bismarck was heading back to Germany and altered his course for several hours. On May 25th, British codebreakers decoded a message showing Bismarck heading for the French port of Brest. The Luftwaffe was to meet them part way and bring the ship in. With the British having lost Bismarck's location and all the miscommunications, the distance between the home fleet and Bismarck kept increasing and increasing, making it less and less likely that the British would be able to intercept Bismarck before she reached friendly waters. However, luck was on the British side, and on May 26th at 10:30 a.m., a Catalina flying boat spotted Bismarck and radioed her location. They calculated that her speed, she would reach U-boat protection in less than 1 day. Only one ship was close enough to try to slow the Bismarck down. This was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, part of Force H, coming up from Gibraltar. The British Swordfish torpedo bombers were very antiquated planes by World War II standards. They were actually biplane designs from World War I. They had an attack speed of under 100 miles an hour, and each only carried one torpedo. However, this was the best chance that the British had, so the Ark Royal launched an airstrike on Bismarck, unaware that the cruiser HMS Sheffield had been detached to shadow Bismarck. The airmen, not aware that any other ships were in the area, attacked the friendly cruiser. Luckily, they were using brand new magnetic detonators on the torpedoes that were untested, and the warheads failed to detonate on target, and so the Sheffield was spared. After rearming the torpedoes with contact detonators, the Swordfish took off again against the Battleship Bismarck. Around the same time, a German U-boat was in perfect range to attack the battle cruiser HMS Renown. However, the sub was out of torpedoes, to the luck of Renown. When the Swordfish attacked Bismarck, she was firing her main battery in front of them like before, and regular anti-aircraft did them as well. However, the British were still able to push the attack. One torpedo struck Bismarck amidships, causing minor damage, but another one struck the battleship in her most vulnerable spot, her rudders. The hit caused the rudder to be stuck in a permanent 12-degree turn to port. At 21:15, Lutyens reported that his ship was completely unmaneuverable and steaming in a large circle. With Bismarck unmaneuverable, the British home fleet could now make plans to intercept and attack the battleship. With fuel shortages, Tovey had fewer ships available for the attack than earlier, but he still had battleships King George V and Rodney, and the heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Norfolk. With the increasingly gloomy outlook for Bismarck, Lutyens sent a message to the German High Command that said, "Ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell, long live the Führer." The mood on the ship was very dark. The German sailors knew that they had little chance against the British home fleet. Bismarck did manage to fire her main guns at the heavy cruiser Sheffield that was shadowing the ship, but scored no hits. However, shrapnel from her middle salvo killed 3 British sailors on the ship. 4 more salvos were fired after this, but there were no hits. Sheffield retreated in smoke and lost contact briefly. Sheffield's captain ordered the destroyers with them to shadow the ship during the night. During the night, the destroyers made several torpedo attacks, firing 16 torpedoes in 9 separate attacks. Bismarck fired her main guns several times, but failed to hit any of the much smaller, more agile destroyers. Just after daylight, the British battleship HMS King George V spotted the Bismarck. However, battleship Rodney was actually the first to open fire, and she did with 2 of her 3 main turrets, firing 6 16-inch shells at the Bismarck. Shortly after, King George V began to fire her own salvos with her 14-inch guns. At 8:50 a.m., Bismarck returned fire with her forward 15-inch guns and quickly straddled HMS Rodney. This accuracy was short-lived, however. With Bismarck's inability to maneuver and the heavy seas, Bismarck could not aim her main guns well. Eventually, the range became close enough for the 3 battleships to fire their secondary guns at each other as well, and the cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire got close enough to open fire with their own 8-inch main battery. At around 9 a.m., a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck the Bismarck in the forward superstructure and severely crippled her forward main guns and killed several hundred men. This salvo more than likely killed Lutyens and Lindemann on the bridge, along with most of the other bridge officers. However, testimony from some survivors of Bismarck said that Lindemann had been on the deck as the ship sank. The main fire control tower of Bismarck was hit, and the forward main guns were hit as well and disabled, but managed to fire a final salvo at 9:27 a.m. The stern main guns continued to fire until the fire control tower for them was hit. The stern main battery then continued to fire independently until 9:31 a.m. when all of the main battery were put out of action from severe damage. The closest hit Bismarck achieved in the battle was just ahead of Rodney, that damaged her starboard torpedo tube. This was the only damage achieved by Bismarck in her last battle. Rodney then launched torpedoes at around 6 miles, and HMS Norfolk did the same. None of the torpedoes hit the target, and this was at around 9:30 a.m. Also at around 9:30 a.m., with Bismarck now a flaming wreck of debris and bodies, the decision was made to scuttle the ship rather than let her fall into British hands. However, the ship was slowly sinking already. Not long after, the order was given to abandon ship. By 10 a.m., the main battery of HMS King George V and Rodney had fired around 700 shells at the now pretty much demolished Bismarck. Rodney then closed the range down to 3,000 yards, which was essentially point-blank range for her guns, and continued to pump shells into the Bismarck. Bismarck was now entirely on fire, and the 4 British ships had fired more than 2,800 shells altogether, and had hit Bismarck around 400 times. But still the ships refused to sink. However, she was down in the stern and listing around 20 degrees to port. Bismarck's superstructure was now nearly completely obliterated by the relentless British salvos and had caused an enormous amount of casualties and flooding to the ship. Rodney then fired 2 torpedoes at Bismarck and struck her 1 time. This was the only time in history that one battleship successfully torpedoed another. However, the case is still disputed to this day. Admiral Tovey refused to cease fire until Bismarck had struck her surrender white ensign flags. At around 10:20 a.m. is when the scuttling charges should have gone off, and shortly after, she took a severe port list, the stern slowly going under and capsizing. By this time, King George V was now short of fuel and had ceased firing. Tovey ordered Dorsetshire to fire torpedoes to finish the Bismarck off. 2 hits were claimed and 2 attacks on both sides of Bismarck. At 10:40 a.m., the once mighty battleship Bismarck slowly slipped beneath the waves. Some survivors reported that they saw Captain Lindemann standing at attention on the stern side of the ship as she sank. Bismarck slowly capsized and sank as British sailors and officers watched in silence as the ship sank. Dorsetshire then arrived at the site of the sinking to pick up survivors in the freezing Atlantic water and began to pull survivors from the sea with ropes. However, at around 11:40 a.m., Dorsetshire got word that a German U-boat was in the area. Her captain knew that the U-boat would not hesitate to torpedo his ship even though they were rescuing Bismarck's men, and he ordered the ship to retreat, leaving hundreds of Bismarck's survivors in the water to slowly freeze to death. From Bismarck's complement of over 2,200 men, only 114 men survived the ordeal. Some Bismarck survivors took this act of leaving so many Germans in the water to freeze to death as an act of revenge for the destruction of the Hood that sank with all crew except 3 survivors. Not long after the loss of Bismarck, her sister ship Tirpitz was finally ready to fight, but was never actually in active combat during the entire war, and unlike Bismarck, she went to the bottom by RAF bombers, never having sunk a single ship. In the end, Tirpitz was kind of a metaphor for the end of the battleship era and the supremacy of the airplane and the aircraft carrier over the battleship. There has never been another battle between 2 battleships since World War II. On June 8, 1989, renowned ocean shipwreck expert Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the wreck of RMS Titanic that sank in 1912, was the first man to discover and photograph the wreck of the German battleship Bismarck. Bismarck rested on the ocean floor at a depth of over 15,000 feet, still sitting upright and very well intact overall. All of her main turrets, funnel, and most of her superstructure was gone, but the main hull and most of the secondary guns were still intact. Only a rear section of the stern was cut off, nearly a perfect straight cut. The wreck of battlecruiser HMS Hood was found years later in 2001 in much worse condition. She was in several pieces and not much was recognizable. One of Hood's survivors, Ted Briggs, was on hand during the expedition and was thrilled but saddened to see his ship again and have some closure. Mr. Briggs sadly passed away since then. Bismarck has been visited several times since the 1989 expedition, with much more advanced cameras and submersibles. The story of the Bismarck has captivated minds for years, including mine. I first found out about her in 3rd grade in the 1990s when I saw a documentary on shipwrecks in school, and Bismarck was in the video. Not long after this, my grandpa showed me the movie Sink the Bismarck, starring Kenneth More, and I have been a huge fan of naval history ever since, especially the story of Bismarck and Hood. Interestingly, Ted Briggs, one of the 3 survivors of HMS Hood, played himself in the movie Sink the Bismarck on board the bridge of HMS Vanguard playing HMS Hood. He can be seen in the same spot that he was in when Hood was hit in the original battle.
Bridge. Smoke bearing green 40, sir. Bismarck and cruiser bearing green 40, about 12 miles. Closing fast.
Those are not cruisers, they are battleships.
Also, Esmond Knight, a former gunnery officer on HMS Prince of Wales, he witnessed the destruction of HMS Hood during her final battle, and he was wounded in the battle, losing an eye. He plays the captain of HMS Prince of Wales in the movie Sink the Bismarck.
God. Yeoman.
Yes, sir?
Make the Admiralty from Prince of Wales. Tell them the hood has blown up.
Aye, aye, sir.
Starboard 15. Starboard 15, sir. Starboard 15.
The movie Sink the Bismarck was filmed in 1959 and 1960, and many of the scenes of Hood and Bismarck's main battery up close were filmed aboard HMS Vanguard, Britain's last battleship. She was sadly scrapped in 1960, not long after the making of the movie.
Right on show! Right on turn off show! Right on turn off show!
Vanguard is another favorite battleship of mine, as she has a similar look to HMS Hood, using essentially the same main battery as Hood, and a similar funnel shape and overall layout. It's such a shame that Vanguard was scrapped. And this now ends my story on Battleship Bismarck. I plan to do more naval documentaries like this in the future if this video does well. I really appreciate everyone watching. Thank you.